For centuries, the great empires prospered, but in a single generation, their world collapsed. Before a single enemy reached the shore, the fall had begun.
For more than a century, around 1200 BCE, the familiar version goes, mysterious warriors appeared from the sea. Cities burned, kingdoms vanished, trade collapsed, and an interconnected world stretching from Greece to Egypt gave way to centuries of political fragmentation. The attackers became known as the Sea Peoples. It is a powerful story. It is also too simple. The Egyptian inscriptions that made the Sea Peoples famous are real. Ramesses III really did commemorate wars against groups he named the Peleset, Jeker, Shikalesh, Denyen, and Weshish. Some cities across the eastern Mediterranean really were destroyed. Several major political systems really did disappear. But the closer archaeologists have looked at the supposed wave of destruction around 1200 BCE, the less it resembles a single synchronized catastrophe. Sites once grouped together as victims of the same disaster were sometimes destroyed decades apart. At others, destruction was assumed rather than demonstrated. And in still other places, life continued through the period in ways the old invasion model struggles to explain. That changes the question. If the Sea Peoples were not one great army sweeping through a stable world, then perhaps the Bronze Age did not collapse because they arrived. Perhaps they became dangerous because the Bronze Age world was already changing beneath them. To understand how, we first have to reconstruct the system they entered. By the 13th century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated civilizations separated by empty sea. It was a political and economic network. Egypt dominated the Nile Valley and projected power into the Levant. The Hittite Empire ruled much of Anatolia and competed for influence farther south. Mycenaean palace societies controlled parts of mainland Greece and the Aegean. On the Syrian coast, cities such as Ugarit linked inland powers to maritime exchange. Cyprus sat between these worlds, tied to regional networks through its ports, merchants, and especially its copper. These states were not equal, and they were not organized in the same way. But their elites operated inside a shared diplomatic and commercial environment. Rulers exchanged gifts, courts sent letters, merchants and ships moved goods between ports. Specialist craftsmen produced weapons, vessels, textiles, and prestige objects. Palaces collected resources from surrounding communities and redirected part of that wealth toward armies, religious institutions, elite households, workshops, and diplomacy. The important point is not that every jar of oil or every piece of metal was controlled by a king. It was not. Markets, local exchange, private merchants, and non-palatial activity also existed. The important point is that the palace was an organizing institution. In a Mycenaean kingdom, for example, the palace did more than provide a home for an elite. It recorded obligations, collected goods, supervised parts of craft production, supported specialists, and helped mobilize military resources. Elsewhere, different institutions performed similar coordinating functions on different scales. That coordination turned resources into power. Copper in the ground is not a fleet. Grain in a field is not an army. A skilled bronze worker is not automatically part of a military system. For those things to become state power, someone has to collect, transport, store, distribute, protect, and direct them. That is what institutions do. And long-distance connectivity made those institutions more capable. A ruler did not need every strategic resource to exist inside his own territory if exchange could bring it from somewhere else. Coastal cities could prosper by linking inland producers to maritime routes. Elites could reinforce political relationships through diplomacy and gift exchange. Craftsmen could work with materials that had traveled hundreds or even thousands of kilometers before reaching their workshops. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was therefore strong partly because it was connected. But connection also creates dependence. Port depends on ships arriving. A palace that supports specialists depends on revenue continuing to flow. An army depends on food, equipment, animals, labor, administration, and political authority. A diplomatic system depends on rulers believing that agreements will still matter tomorrow. None of those dependencies means the late Bronze Age world was a fragile machine waiting for one missing shipment to destroy it. Real societies have redundancy. People adapt. Routes change. Local economies continue even when rulers struggle. But when several parts of a political system come under pressure at the same time, the cost of coordination rises. A ruler who loses territory has fewer resources. A city facing insecurity must spend more on defense. Trade becomes harder when ports or roads are unsafe. Local elites gain room to act independently when central authority weakens. And the people who once operated inside a stable hierarchy, soldiers, sailors, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, administrators, do not disappear when that hierarchy begins to fail. They still have skills. They still have ships. They still have weapons. They still know the routes. What changes is the system organizing them. That distinction is the key to the Sea Peoples, because around the end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean did not simply go dark. Some political centers were destroyed. Some were abandoned. Some lost their administrative role. Some regions remained active. Some networks continued. New settlements appeared. The old system was breaking unevenly, and that meant the same sea that had connected palaces, merchants, diplomats, and royal courts could increasingly connect people operating outside the control of those palaces. Before we can understand what those people did, however, we need to separate one of the most enduring images of the Bronze Age collapse from the evidence beneath it. There was no single night when the Mediterranean burned. The phrase Bronze Age collapse encourages us to imagine an event, a before, a disaster, and an after, but the archaeological record is much less cooperative. Across the eastern Mediterranean, major political changes unfolded over decades. Some cities were destroyed by fire, others were damaged and rebuilt. Some settlements were abandoned without evidence of a violent attack. In several regions, centralized administration disappeared even though people continued living nearby. And some communities survived the crisis well enough to participate in the world that followed. This matters because destruction and collapse are not the same thing. A city can burn without its civilization disappearing. A palace can survive physically while losing the political system that once made it important. And a kingdom can collapse even when many of its inhabitants remain exactly where they were. Mycenaean Greece makes the distinction particularly clear. During the final decades of the 13th century BCE, several major centers were already experiencing instability. Buildings at Mycenae and Tiryns had suffered destruction before the final end of the palatial period. GLA was burned and deserted. Other settlements were abandoned or reorganized. Then, around the transition into the 12th century BCE, the Mycenaean palace system ceased to function. The palaces were not rebuilt as palaces. Linear B administration disappeared. The centralized political structures that had organized significant parts of elite production, taxation, storage, and military mobilization disappeared with them. But Greece did not become empty. People continued to live there. Pottery continued to be made. Communities reorganized. Trade and movement continued, although under different political conditions. So when we say Mycenaean civilization collapsed, the most important loss was not population itself. It was organization. The same warning applies when we zoom out. The Hittite Empire also disappeared as a great territorial state. Ugarit, one of the most important commercial kingdoms on the Syrian coast, was destroyed and never recovered its previous political role. Egypt survived, but entered the 12th century facing pressures of its own. Cyprus experienced destruction at some sites while other communities persisted and reorganized. These developments belong to the same broad era. They do not necessarily belong to the same event. That distinction has become increasingly important because archaeologists have been going back to the original excavation reports behind the famous maps of the Bronze Age collapse. Those maps often look devastating. Dozens of sites are marked with symbols for destruction, producing the impression of a wave moving across the Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. But a destruction symbol hides several questions. Was the site actually destroyed? When did the destruction happen? Was the entire settlement affected or only part of it? Was the cause warfare, earthquake, accidental fire, civil conflict, or something that cannot be identified? And perhaps most importantly, who connected that destruction to the larger collapse in the first place? When archaeologist Jesse Millick re-examined 153 proposed destruction events commonly associated with the period around 1200 BCE, he concluded that 94, more than 60%, should not belong to the conventional destruction narrative as they had often been presented. Some were dated outside the relevant period. Some had simply been assumed. Others had entered later scholarship through citations that did not match what the original excavation reports actually demonstrated. That does not mean 60% of the Bronze Age collapse was imaginary. It means the evidence had gradually been compressed into a cleaner story than archaeology could support. And even among the destructions that remain, there is no single fingerprint. At some sites, evidence may be consistent with warfare or deliberate violence. At others, the cause remains unknown. At still others, only particular buildings appear to have been affected. This is not what we would expect from one army using one method in one coordinated campaign across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. More importantly, it does not explain why entire political systems failed. Destroying a palace is an event. Preventing that palace system from recovering is a deeper historical process. That process had already begun before some of the most famous final destructions. In Mycenaean Greece, evidence from the late 13th century points to repeated instability before the palaces disappeared for good. The final catastrophes therefore struck institutions that were not necessarily operating under the same conditions they had enjoyed generations earlier. This does not tell us what caused every crisis. It does tell us to stop searching for a single moment when everything went wrong. Drought may have mattered in some areas. Warfare certainly mattered somewhere. Political conflict may have mattered. Earthquakes occurred. Trade disruption could intensify existing problems. Migration could create new pressures. But listing possible causes does not explain the system. The more useful question is what these pressures did to political capacity. Could rulers still collect resources? Could they still defend roads and ports? Could they still maintain armies and reward followers? Could they still guarantee the relationships that made long-distance exchange predictable? Could they still prevent ambitious local actors from operating independently? When enough of those answers began turning from yes to no, the strategic environment changed even if the coastline, ships, markets, and people remained. And this is where the familiar invasion narrative creates a trap. If we begin with destroyed cities and then notice Egyptian records describing enemies from the sea, it is tempting to connect the two automatically. Cities burned. Sea peoples existed. Therefore, the sea peoples burned the cities. But chronology is not causality. Even the Egyptian evidence does not describe a single ethnic nation called the Sea Peoples conducting one grand Mediterranean offensive. That name is ours. The Egyptians recorded several different groups at different moments under different circumstances. Some fought Egypt. Some names appear in records before the famous reign of Ramesses III. Some may have included populations connected to regions far apart from one another, and their precise identities remain disputed. So before asking whether these people destroyed the Bronze Age, we have to ask a more basic question. Who exactly are we talking about when we say the Sea Peoples? The first problem with the Sea Peoples is the name itself. No Egyptian pharaoh announced that he had defeated a nation called the Sea Peoples. The phrase is a modern label, created by scholars to group together several peoples named in Egyptian records from the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. Those records do not present one fixed coalition appearing again and again. Instead, different names appear in different combinations. Under Merneptah, groups such as the Aquesh, Teresh, Lukka, Shikalesh, and Shurden appear in connection with a Libyan attack on Egypt. Decades later, the inscriptions of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu describe another coalition that included the Peleset, Sheker, Shikalesh, Denyen, and Weshish. Some of these names were already known to Egypt before the crisis reached its most famous phase. Modern historians grouped these scattered references together because they seem to belong to the same broad pattern of maritime warfare and population movement. That grouping is useful, but it can also mislead us. The moment we say the Sea Peoples, grammar turns several groups into a single actor. We begin asking where they came from, what they wanted, and why they attacked, as if one government had issued one plan to one people. The sources do not justify that certainty. Even their geographic origins remain disputed. Some of the names appear tantalizingly similar to names known from other parts of the Mediterranean. The Denyen have often been compared with the Danaoi, one of the Homeric names later used for Greeks. The Aquesh have been linked by some scholars to the Achaeans. The Shurden have famously been connected to Sardinia. The Shikalesh have been compared with Sicily, while the Lukka are much more securely associated with southwestern Anatolia. These comparisons are attractive because they seem to turn mysterious Egyptian names into a map. But sound resemblance is not a passport. Languages change. Egyptian scribes rendered foreign names through their own writing system. Similar-looking names can be coincidental, and even when a geographic connection is plausible, it does not tell us exactly who was present in a particular army generations later. The Denyen are a good example. A connection with the Greek Danaoi is possible and has a long history in scholarship. But it remains an identification, not a fact written into the Egyptian record itself. The same caution becomes even more important with the Aquesh and Achaeans, where the proposed linguistic connection is weaker. So ethnicity alone cannot solve the problem. Social organization may tell us more. Egyptian texts do not describe these groups in exactly the same political language used for every foreign kingdom. Analysis of the titles assigned to their leaders, together with the relatively small numbers of captives recorded in some Egyptian victory lists, has led archaeologist Uros Matic to argue that at least some of the groups may have operated more like warrior bands, raiders or mercenaries, than entire migrating nations moving as unified peoples. That does not settle the issue either. One famous scene at Medinet Habu depicts women and children accompanying one of the groups. Elsewhere, archaeological and genetic evidence will show that real population movement and permanent settlement did occur during this period. The two pictures are not necessarily contradictory. A Mediterranean in crisis could contain armed bands, migrating families, mercenaries, traders, refugees, and settlers at the same time. Different Egyptian texts may be recording different pieces of that larger process. This is why the question, who were the sea peoples, may never have a single answer. There may never have been one people to identify. The more useful question is why so many mobile groups could become militarily and politically important in the same historical window. And once we ask that, the mystery begins to move away from ethnicity and toward the system around them. Because the most important thing about these people may not have been where they originally came from. It may have been what happened when political control weakened, but the routes across the sea remained open. Political systems can collapse faster than geography. That sounds obvious, but it is one of the most important facts behind the sea peoples. When a palace falls, the coastline does not change. The sailing seasons do not disappear. The harbors remain where they were. And the generations of sailors who knew how to move between the Aegean, Cyprus, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant do not suddenly forget the sea. This is why the end of the Bronze Age should not be imagined as the Mediterranean network simply switching off. The network changed. During the Palatial Age, maritime movement operated inside a world dominated by powerful political centers. Ships carried copper, ceramics, foodstuffs, luxury objects, and other goods between regions whose rulers maintained diplomatic relationships and whose ports belonged to recognizable political systems. Those rulers did not control every voyage, but states helped create the environment in which voyages took place. They protected territory. They mobilized labor. They concentrated wealth. They supported armies. They maintained relationships with other courts. And in many places, they gave merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and warriors a political framework within which their skills had value. When that framework weakened, those skills did not vanish. Their value changed. Imagine a sailor whose family has spent generations navigating between islands and coastal ports. The destruction of a palace does not make him incapable of reaching Cyprus. Imagine a bronze worker whose livelihood depended partly on elite demand. The disappearance of the court does not erase his knowledge. And imagine an armed retainer whose status once depended on a ruler capable of rewarding military service. If that ruler can no longer pay, command, or protect him, the warrior does not cease to be armed. He faces a new set of choices. Stay, serve another leader, move somewhere more secure, escort merchants, join an expedition, or use force for his own advantage. We cannot prove that any specific Sea Peoples group formed through exactly this sequence. The surviving evidence is far too incomplete for that. But the wider mechanism matters because the post-Palatial Mediterranean created more space for precisely these kinds of choices. Political fragmentation changes what is possible. Under a strong state, an armed band attempting to seize a port may confront a centralized military response. Under a fragmented system, the same band might find competing local rulers, weak defenses, or communities looking for additional fighting men. A migrant population entering a stable kingdom may have to submit to an established political order. The same population entering a region where authority has fractured may become part of the creation of a new order. And a merchant operating along a secure route behaves differently from one navigating a coast where protection, raiding, smuggling, and armed escort increasingly overlap. This does not mean trade simply became piracy, nor does it mean every sailor became a warrior. The distinction is more important than that. The old maritime infrastructure could survive while the institutions regulating it weakened. And there is evidence that Eastern Mediterranean connectivity did survive the fall of the great palatial systems. Material culture from the 12th century BCE shows continued contacts across the Aegean, Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Levant. The archaeological picture after 1200 is poorer in written documentation because many of the institutions that produced archives disappeared, but the surviving objects do not describe a Mediterranean sealed into isolated regional worlds. Cyprus is especially important. Even during the turmoil surrounding the end of the Bronze Age, the island remained deeply connected to neighboring regions. Aegean, Cypriot, and Levantine traditions increasingly appeared together rather than one simply erasing another. Across the wider Mediterranean, pottery styles and technologies continued to move. People moved too. In other words, the collapse of centralized political systems did not destroy the capacity for long-distance movement. It loosened the relationship between movement and the institutions that had previously organized much of it. That created opportunity. For traders, it could mean finding new markets when old palace demand disappeared. For local elites, it could mean building power without answering to the political centers that had once dominated them. For migrants, it could mean finding land or employment somewhere else. For mercenaries, it could mean rulers competing for their service. And for raiders, it could mean more vulnerable targets and fewer states capable of policing the routes between them. The same ship could even participate in more than one of these worlds. Ancient maritime society did not necessarily divide people neatly into professional categories recognizable to a modern state. A crew might trade when conditions were favorable, carry armed men when someone paid them, and use violence when opportunity or necessity arose. We should be careful not to turn that possibility into a universal description of the sea peoples. But it explains why the categories that seem clear to us, merchant, migrant, mercenary, pirate, can become difficult to separate in periods of political fragmentation. And that gives us a different way to understand the crisis. The sea peoples did not require the Mediterranean network to disappear. They required it to remain connected enough for people to move, while becoming politically fragmented enough for that movement to escape older forms of control. That is the paradox at the center of this story. The Bronze Age system was becoming weaker. The sea was still open. And one of the clearest places to see what happened when those two realities collided was the Aegean world after the fall of the Mycenaean palaces. The collapse of the Mycenaean palaces did not erase the Aegean world. It changed the way that world was organized. Around the end of the 13th century BCE, the great palatial centers that had dominated much of mainland Greece ceased to function. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes belonged to a political order built around centralized administration, elite authority, storage, record-keeping, and the redistribution of resources. When that order disappeared, it was not rebuilt. Linear B administration vanished with it. Some specialist industries that had depended heavily on palace demand declined or disappeared, but other skills survived. Bronze working continued, shipbuilding continued, communities continued producing pottery, burying their dead, fighting local rivals, and maintaining contacts beyond the Aegean. This is one of the most important corrections to the idea of a total collapse. The end of the palaces did not mean the end of Mycenaean society. It meant that people were operating inside a different political landscape. In the 12th century BCE, power became more local. Instead of large palace-centered states dominating wide territories, smaller communities and competing elite groups became more important. Some regions that had never been tightly integrated into the palatial system may even have gained relative freedom as the major centers disappeared. For the people living through this transition, that meant the old hierarchy of obligations and opportunities was being rewritten. A craftsman who once supplied a palace workshop might now work for a local elite or another community. A warrior whose status depended on one political center might attach himself to another. A sailor could continue moving across the same waters even though the ruler who once dominated his home port was gone. None of this proves that these people became sea peoples, but it gives us a historical environment in which greater mobility makes sense. The archaeological record of the post-palatial Aegean shows both continuity and change. Certain traditions survived for generations. Others disappeared quickly. New local power structures emerged. Long-distance contact did not end, and interaction between smaller communities became increasingly important to political life. This matters because the Aegean had never been isolated from the Eastern Mediterranean. Long before the palaces fell, Mycenaean elites participated in networks that reached Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt. Hittite texts probably refer to at least part of this Aegean political world as a Hiwa. Whatever the precise geography of that term, the correspondence shows that Western powers were significant enough to enter high-level Hittite diplomacy. So when the Mycenaean palace system collapsed, the people living in the Aegean did not suddenly discover the Eastern Mediterranean. They already knew that world. The routes existed. Objects had moved along them for generations. Political relationships had connected Western Anatolia and the Aegean to larger Eastern powers. And coastal communities already possessed the maritime knowledge required to move through that network. What changed was the political framework behind that movement. This is where the proposed connections between Mycenaeans and some sea peoples become tempting. Names such as Denyen and Aquesh have been compared with Greek ethnonyms. Aegean-style pottery appears farther east. Later traditions preserve memories of Greek-speaking populations moving into Western Anatolia and Cyprus. Taken together, these clues make Aegean participation in the wider movements of the 12th century entirely plausible. But they do not allow us to say that the sea peoples were simply Mycenaeans under another name. The Aegean itself was fragmented. Different communities had different experiences. Some people stayed. Some settlements declined. Others expanded. Some groups may have moved short distances within Greece. Others crossed the sea. And the people who traveled east were not necessarily all warriors. They may have included families, craftsmen, sailors, traders, armed retainers, and people seeking places where the political and economic conditions were more favorable than those they had left behind. This is why the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces matters, even if we can never identify a specific Egyptian ethnonym as definitively Greek. The Aegean gives us an example of what happens when a major political system disappears but the population, skills, weapons, and maritime knowledge remain. The old state has vanished. The human capabilities have not. And once those capabilities are released into a more fragmented political environment, movement becomes one possible form of adaptation. The strongest evidence for what happened next does not come from an Egyptian name. It comes from an island positioned directly between the Aegean and the Levant, Cyprus. If the Aegean shows what happens when a palace system disappears, Cyprus shows why the aftermath cannot be reduced to invasion. Geographically, the island sat almost perfectly between worlds. To the west lay the Aegean, to the north, Anatolia, to the east, the Levant, to the south, Egypt. And Cyprus possessed one resource every major Bronze Age power valued: copper. For centuries, the island had been deeply embedded in Eastern Mediterranean exchange. Ships approaching from different directions could reach its harbors. Merchants could move goods through it. Foreign objects circulated there long before the crisis of the 12th century BCE. So when the political landscape around Cyprus began to change, the island was not an isolated target waiting for invaders. It was a crossroads. That makes what happened there especially revealing. Older interpretations often described the end of the Cypriot Bronze Age as a colonization story. Aegean populations arrived after the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces. They settled the island. Their material culture spread. And over time, Cyprus became increasingly Greek-speaking. There is almost certainly real migration somewhere inside that story, but the archaeology refuses to behave like a simple replacement. During the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, Cypriot material culture did not become purely Mycenaean. It became mixed. Pottery combined Aegean forms with Cypriot traditions. Some objects show Levantine influences as well. Architectural practices, burial customs, metalwork, religious imagery, and ceramics reveal communities selecting and recombining traditions rather than simply copying one foreign culture. That matters because archaeologists once relied heavily on pottery to trace the movements of peoples. If a vessel looked Mycenaean, it was tempting to imagine a Mycenaean person standing behind it. But pottery can travel without people, and styles can travel even when the pottery itself does not. Scientific analysis has shown that Aegean-style pottery could be produced on Cyprus itself. Local craftspeople could adopt foreign technologies, shapes, and decorative traditions and combine them with Cypriot practices. A pot could therefore look culturally Aegean while being physically Cypriot. That single fact creates a serious problem for any attempt to map ethnicity directly from ceramics. But it does not mean migration was imaginary. It means migration interacted with local agency. People arriving from elsewhere did not enter an empty island. They entered existing communities with their own institutions, traditions, trading relationships, and craftsmen. Newcomers could marry into those communities. Local elites could adopt foreign styles because they carried status. Craftsmen could imitate imported goods. Foreign technologies could become local traditions. And within only a few generations, separating what was originally Aegean, Cypriot, or Levantine could become extremely difficult. This is why Cyprus is so important to the Sea People's problem. It shows us that movement during the collapse did not have to look like conquest. A population could relocate without annihilating the people already there. A warrior could arrive and later become a settler. A trader could become part of a local community. A foreign object could inspire a local industry. And a society exposed to migration could change profoundly without being replaced. There is another important lesson. Cyprus also demonstrates that connectivity itself survived the crisis. The pattern of exchange changed. Some long-distance trade declined. Certain markets disappeared. Supply chains reorganized. But people, goods, and ideas continued moving into and out of the island. Movement and cultural interaction continued even as older political structures were being dismantled. This is exactly the paradox we have been building toward. The Bronze Age system had used connectivity to strengthen palace states. After those states weakened, connectivity did not automatically disappear. Instead, the same maritime geography could support a more fragmented world. Aegean newcomers could reach Cyprus because centuries of contact had already connected the island to the west. Levantine influences could reach it from the east. Cypriot communities could absorb both and produce something new. The result was not simply colonization. It was reorganization. And that changes how we should imagine the people moving through this world. They were not necessarily advancing along a single invasion route. They were entering nodes in an existing network and becoming part of the societies they encountered. Cyprus therefore breaks one of the easiest equations in Bronze Age history. Foreign-looking material does not automatically mean foreign conquest. But it also creates a new problem. If pottery can move and styles can be copied, then material culture alone cannot prove that significant populations crossed the Mediterranean. To find stronger evidence that actual people moved, not just their objects or ideas, we have to travel southeast from Cyprus to the coastal cities of Philistia. There, archaeology is joined by something pottery cannot provide: ancient DNA. Cyprus shows why foreign-looking objects cannot be treated as proof of foreign people. Philistia shows why we cannot make the opposite mistake either. Sometimes people really did move. During the 12th century BCE, several cities on the southern coast of Canaan developed a material culture strikingly different from what had existed there during the Late Bronze Age. Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron would later become three of the major cities associated with the Philistines. The Egyptian Peliset are widely connected with this Philistine phenomenon, although, as with almost every identity in this period, the relationship should not be treated as a perfectly documented ethnic equation. What archaeologists can see much more clearly is change. New forms of pottery appeared. Food practices changed. Architecture and household traditions developed new features. Some of these elements had strong parallels in the Aegean and Cyprus. For decades, that evidence fueled a straightforward explanation. Migrants from the Aegean had arrived on the coast of Canaan and established new communities. Then the pottery complicated the story. At Tel Miknekron, scientific analysis showed that Mycenaean-style pottery found in the early Philistine levels was not simply imported from Greece. It had been made locally. The shapes and decoration could look Aegean, while the clay came from the region itself. Once again, style was not a passport. That opened the door to alternatives. Perhaps local populations were adopting foreign fashions. Perhaps merchants carried ideas rather than large populations. Perhaps craftsmen moved while most of the population remained local. Archaeology alone could not easily tell us how many people stood behind the cultural change. Then human remains from Ashkelon added another line of evidence. Researchers recovered usable genome-wide data from 10 individuals spanning the Bronze and Iron Ages. The sample was small, and that limitation matters. But the pattern was striking. The Bronze Age individuals largely reflected the genetic ancestry already established in the Levant. The early Iron Age individuals still derived most of their ancestry from that local Levantine gene pool, but they also carried a new European-related component that was not detectable in the earlier Ashkelon samples. Something demographic had happened. People had moved. The researchers found that, among the ancient populations available for comparison, a southern European-related population provided the best model for the incoming ancestry. But this is precisely where the evidence must not be pushed too far. The DNA does not say Greek. Genes do not record language. They do not tell us what political identity a person claimed. They cannot tell us whether someone considered himself Mycenaean, Cypriot, Pelasite, or something for which no name survives. And the study itself could not pinpoint the incoming population to one homeland. The source might ultimately prove more closely connected to the Aegean. It might involve Cyprus. Other Mediterranean populations may also have contributed. More ancient DNA is required to resolve that geography. So the correct conclusion is narrower, but still extremely important. At the beginning of the Iron Age, Ashkelon experienced gene flow from a population carrying ancestry related to Europe, at roughly the same historical transition when the archaeological record shows the emergence of Philistine culture. Actual migration was part of the story, but what happened next is just as important as the arrival. The European-related genetic signal did not remain clearly detectable in the later Iron Age sample from Ashkelon. Within no more than a few centuries, it had been diluted into a population that again appeared overwhelmingly related to the local Levantine gene pool. That is not the genetic signature of a population remaining permanently separate from everyone around it. Points toward integration. Newcomers arrived. They became part of local communities. Their descendants mixed with people already living in the region. And at the same time, the culture identified as Philistine continued developing its own political and social character. This gives us a much better model than either extreme. The first extreme imagines an unstoppable foreign people arriving, destroying the old population, and replacing it. The second imagines that nothing significant happened demographically, and that foreign-looking material culture was simply fashion. Ashkelon tells us that neither model is sufficient. There was cultural borrowing. There was local production. There was continuity among Levantine populations. And there was migration. All of those processes could happen at once. This is exactly what we would expect in a Mediterranean where older political boundaries were weakening but long-distance movement continued. The people entering Philistia were not merely passing through as raiders. At least some newcomers stayed long enough to become part of new societies. That transforms the Sea People's problem again. We began with warriors attacking cities from the sea. Now we are looking at something broader. Armed conflict, migration, cultural exchange, and permanent settlement unfolding inside the same period of political fragmentation. But there is still one major problem with the idea that these mobile groups brought down the Bronze Age world. Not every state they confronted collapsed. Egypt did not. And the way Egypt responded reveals the limit of the Sea Peoples as an explanation. If mobile warriors and migrants were enough to destroy a Bronze Age state, Egypt presents a problem, because Egypt survived. In the 8th regnal year of Ramesses III, Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe a major confrontation with a coalition including the Pelasite, Sheker, Shikalesh, Denyen, and Weshish. The temple walls present the result exactly as royal monuments were designed to present it. The pharaoh is overwhelming. The enemy is broken. Egypt is saved by the strength of its king. We should not mistake that imagery for an objective battle report. Ramesses III was commemorating victory, not writing military history for future archaeologists. But beneath the royal propaganda is evidence for a real military confrontation serious enough to become one of the defining achievements of his reign. And the most revealing part of the story is not whether every detail carved at Medinet Habu happened exactly as depicted. It is that Egypt could still organize a response. The reliefs portray fighting on both land and water. In the naval scene, enemy vessels are shown caught among Egyptian ships while archers participate in the fighting from the shore. The accompanying inscriptions describe enemies advancing toward Egypt, although the exact locations and sequence of the campaign remain debated. We do not need to resolve that debate to understand the strategic point. Egypt possessed something several collapsing states no longer did: a functioning center capable of turning resources into coordinated military force. The Egyptian state could gather troops, could employ foreign soldiers alongside Egyptians, could defend approaches to its core territory, could organize forces on land and water. It could sustain command under a pharaoh whose government still possessed taxation, administration, storage, and a large agricultural base. None of those advantages made Egypt invulnerable. The new kingdom was already far from the expansionist power it had been centuries earlier. Egyptian control in the Levant was contracting, and the reign of Ramesses III itself would experience serious economic and political problems. Survival was not the same as continued dominance. But survival matters enormously to our question. Compare Egypt with a fragmented coastal kingdom whose central administration has already failed. The attackers may be similar. Their opportunity is not. Against a weak or divided target, a relatively small armed group may be able to raid a port, seize resources, enter the service of a local ruler, or participate in the creation of a new settlement. Against a state still capable of concentrating manpower and defending strategic approaches, the same group faces a very different problem. This is why the Sea Peoples cannot function as a universal explanation for the end of the Bronze Age. If their mere presence caused state collapse, Egypt becomes difficult to explain. If instead their effectiveness depended partly on the condition of the systems they encountered, Egypt makes sense. Where authority had fractured, mobility could become leverage. Where authority remained strong enough to mobilize and coordinate, mobility met resistance. The lesson is not that Egypt defeated the Sea Peoples because Egyptians were inherently superior. Nor should Ramesses III be turned into the heroic commander who single-handedly stopped civilization from falling. The deeper variable was institutional capacity. A state is not powerful merely because it has soldiers. It is powerful when it can convert population, food, weapons, information, transportation, command, and political authority into organized action at the moment they are needed. Egypt could still do that. Some of its neighbors increasingly could not. And that reverses the old story one final time. The question is no longer why the Sea Peoples were powerful enough to destroy the Bronze Age. It is why the breakdown of the Bronze Age system created so many places where mobile groups could suddenly become powerful. Because by this point, the causal arrow was running in both directions. Political fragmentation created opportunities for raiding, migration, and settlement. Those movements could then impose new costs on already weakened political systems. The crisis was producing mobility, and mobility could deepen the crisis. By now, the old question has become too small. Were the Sea Peoples responsible for the Bronze Age collapse? In some places, armed groups almost certainly added pressure to states already struggling to maintain control. Raids could destroy supplies, interrupt communications, weaken ports, and force rulers to divert resources toward defense. Migrants and armed settlers could alter local balances of power. Mercenaries could strengthen one ruler against another. But those effects depended on the political environment they entered. A functioning state could resist. A fragmented one offered opportunities. And that means the Sea Peoples were neither simply the cause of the crisis nor merely its victims. They belonged to a feedback loop. As palace-centered political systems weakened, older structures of employment, security, redistribution, and military organization weakened with them. Yet the Mediterranean remained connected enough for people to move. Warriors could move. Sailors could move. Craftsmen could move. Families could move. Goods, technologies, and ideas could still cross the sea. In that environment, mobility gained new strategic importance. Some people moved because conditions had deteriorated where they lived. Some may have sought service under new rulers. Some settled. Some traded. Some raided. And once those movements increased instability in already vulnerable regions, they could contribute to further political breakdown. Collapse encouraged mobility. Mobility could accelerate collapse. But this process did not operate identically everywhere. That is why Cyprus could remain a crossroads while absorbing new populations and cultural influences. Why Philistine communities could emerge through a mixture of migration and local continuity. Why parts of the Mycenaean world fragmented into new political arrangements. And why Egypt could fight back. The variable was never simply whether the Sea Peoples appeared. It was the condition of the system they encountered. And this finally explains the title. The collapsing Bronze Age world did not create the Sea Peoples from nothing. Maritime raiding existed before the Great Crisis. Foreign warriors had served Bronze Age kings before the palaces fell. People had migrated across the Mediterranean for generations. What the collapse created was a new strategic environment. It weakened many of the institutions that had once organized movement, protected routes, employed military labor, and concentrated political power. At the same time, it left enough of the maritime network intact for people to continue moving through it. That combination transformed what mobility could mean. A raiding group that once existed at the margins of powerful kingdoms could become a serious threat to a fragmented coast. A migrant community could become the foundation of a new political society. A mercenary force could become a local power. A trade route could become a migration route, a military route, or all three at once. The sea peoples therefore make more sense when we stop imagining them as the mysterious force that arrived from outside history to destroy civilization. They were actors inside a larger transformation. Some helped destabilize the world around them. Some adapted to its destruction. Some settled inside the political spaces it opened. And many were eventually absorbed into the new societies that replaced the old Bronze Age order. The real story is not that civilization suddenly vanished beneath a wave of invaders. It is that one way of organizing the Mediterranean became increasingly difficult to sustain, while the people, skills, routes, and connections that had existed inside that system survived long enough to be reorganized. The palaces could disappear. The sea remained. And in the space between those two realities, the peoples we now call the Sea Peoples became powerful enough to enter history.